Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Wednesday, the 28th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We start off with just a quick admin note here for special projects. If you know deep down, if you feel like maybe you're not doing enough, and every time another crisis hits, either at home or around the world, that gnawing feeling gets worse, and you ask yourself, what if this happened here? If you've ever imagined yourself being the local go-to for intelligence and crisis coordination, if you ever felt the burden of leadership when others are panicking, then special projects may be for you. I'm holding an information session coming up on Thursday, the 29th of May. That is tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Central. I'll describe what you can get out of this intelligence training membership, and there is a link in this morning's report. I also sent an email out yesterday, Jared did, with that link where you can register. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into our domestic sit rep or roll-up items. Robert, good morning. Let's start off with this student visa vetting. There was a pause that the Trump administration announced. Are they going to unpause this now? What's going on?
Good morning, Mike. Yeah, yesterday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio ordered all U.S. embassies to pause scheduling new interviews for student visas. And he said this is in preparation for the Trump administration expanding vetting procedures. And they're considering expanding social media screening and vetting for all student and exchange visitor visas. I think on the surface, this is targeting foreign students that are engaging in political organization on U.S. campuses, especially these pro-Palestine protests we've seen over the last couple of years and these campus takeovers. However, I also think this could be used to put more scrutiny on other student visas, like especially the Chinese foreign exchange students who are coming over to the U.S. And I think the last time we talked about the numbers, it was over 350,000 in the United States that have engaged in espionage inside of the United States in multiple instances.
Mm-hmm. Just real quick on this. Several years ago, and he took a lot of heat over it, but several years ago, this guy named John Schindler, he's a former NSA counterintelligence officer, and / agent, I think they're technically called agents. One of the things he said was, if you want to stop Chinese espionage in the United States, you have to stop putting Chinese people in American universities, Chinese nationals in American universities, and you have to stop putting Chinese nationals in our tech and industrial and agricultural sectors, because they are just waiting to be debriefed by the Ministry of State Security. In so many words, that's what he said. But he said there's no political will to do that, so Chinese espionage will continue. So I think anything the State Department can do to help weed out those. And the problem is, I think many Chinese nationals come over here not to conduct espionage, but what ends up happening is they go home, and when they step off the plane going back to China, they get debriefed. They get pulled into a secondary screening room, and there are Chinese intelligence officers there, and they will use that opportunity to either gather information or direct them to go back and collect more information and bring it back. I mean, just time and time again, we've seen massive numbers of these DOJ indictments against Chinese nationals working or studying in the United States, also conducting espionage. Huge problem, no political will to solve it, although this does seem like a step in the right direction. Robert, thanks for that. Let's go ahead and move on down to Nashville. What's going on?
Rep. Andy Ogles, who's a Republican from Tennessee, he announced the House Judiciary and Homeland Committees are going to investigate Nashville, Tennessee Mayor Freddie O'Connell. And Ogles said that this is for potentially aiding and abetting illegal immigration and obstructing some ICE operations that were conducted in Nashville earlier this month. He said what he's requesting from the mayor, any documents or communications about an order from O'Connell that all Nashville employees would have to report communications with ICE directly to his office, and any correspondence between city employees and pro-immigration nonprofits and NGOs. And I think Ogles was referring to, there were reports of this group called the Remix Tennessee that were apparently out observing and putting out warnings about these ICE operations, because they were working in conjunction with local law enforcement during traffic stops. So I think this is the nonprofit that Ogles is talking about when he says aiding and abetting illegal immigration.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like they expect there's some level of coordination there between the Nashville mayor's office and these NGOs.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, and this is probably a preliminary step before they recommend some kind of charges to DOJ or the Trump administration takes the similar actions to what they've done in other sanctuary cities and states. I think so far they're now up to 5 sanctuary states or blue states and sanctuary cities that they have either levied criminal or civil charges against officials for obstructing ICE operations.
Mhm. Well, Tom Homan said that's coming. That's the next step, and I guess it's here at a very low level. All right, let's move on. And Robert, I'll just let you take it through the rest of the domestics that rep here.
So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a Department of Health and Human Services, they announced yesterday that they're going to ramp up financial oversight over state Medicaid agencies. And they said the intent is to make sure that federal dollars are not being used as what the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services head, who's Dr. Oz. They want to make sure that these federal dollars are not being used as quote a backdoor pathway to subsidize open borders, and they are going to claw back this money, these federal dollars from states that they find that they're improperly spending this money, which I think is another blow to these sanctuary state budget deficits that they've been warning about. When that, as we've reported previously on other issues like requiring them to cover 5% of SNAP expenditures and other money that was previously given by the federal government. And other state governments are now ramping up their trade diplomacy talks. The governors of Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, and Rhode Island are planning to meet with Canadian premiers in June. And their intent is to discuss trade and tariffs. And Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont, he said that governors across the U.S. are scrambling with these uncertainties over the tariffs. So these are just the latest in. I think there have been multiple other states that have already taken similar trade delegations overseas. I think the most recent was Arizona going to Taiwan. And then Texas bills at Governor Greg Abbott's desk, their HB 45 and HB 5138 are going to expand Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton's powers to unilaterally investigate human trafficking and election fraud. In 2021, I think Ken Paxton made this initial push to investigate local election fraud or allegations of fraud, and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled against him and said that he could only do this at the request of local officials. But now this bill, HB 5138, which I think is the more important out of the two, is going to allow Paxton to do that unilaterally. And Abbott has publicly criticized that previous court decision, so I think he's likely to sign this bill.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good news, not only here in Texas, but also just for national security, because a lot of these human trafficking networks around the country have a nexus in these border states, especially Texas. All right, Robert, thanks for that. And hopefully the Attorney General's office can pull on that thread and maybe have it go other places as well. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to our global sit rep items, starting with India and Pakistan. Go ahead, Jared.
Absolutely. So both India and Pakistan are increasing their purchases of military air platforms, and this is in response to the recent border conflict. So this is the first indicator we've actually gotten on, hey, how do these things perform? Pakistan's consulting Turkey and China to increase its native UAV production, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. And India is investing $4.6 billion into its own manned fighter aircraft and UAV production. Now, this allows for some lower level escalation steps in the latter, but this points toward, hey, how do these things perform? Well, it looks like India is far more. They liked how their aircraft performed, their manned aircraft performed far more than how Pakistan did, because Pakistan is not investing in its own, and it's not buying any Chinese. Mm-hmm. And then, kind of staying on the topic of China there, China and its ambassador to Colombia announced that it would be offering Colombia and Latin America as a whole a $35 billion investment into more than 100 infrastructure projects yesterday. They didn't elaborate which ones would be here, but this is all part of trying to peel Colombia off of the United States sphere of influence. Then staying in Latin America, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary and her Mexican counterpart they agreed to install a new GBG fly production facility. That's the sterilized screwworm fly, with the aim of eradicating the cattle screwworm that has halted cattle exports from Mexico to the United States. And all of this aims to allow that to reopen.
Mhm.
Then, lastly, over in Greenland, Greenland's natural resources minister said in response to a question about Chinese investment in Greenland's mining industry that Greenland prefers to work with the Europeans and the Americans in this sector, but if necessary, would look elsewhere. So, in response to a question about, hey, what about China? Yes, we would consider China, but that's only if neither of the other preferred candidates wanted to invest. Now, here's the thing. I think she's bluffing because she has actually a pretty robust track record of shutting down Chinese mining in Greenland. One of them was specifically for iron. They didn't pay their workers, and she said, "Fine, you won't mine here." And there are 2 other stalled projects from China for mining that she has just said, "No, you won't do it." So I think she's just bluffing in order to get investment rolling from the Europeans and Americans.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was about to say, Greenland inviting Chinese investment into its mining sectors is a really good way to become the 51st state. I mean, if you really want to draw Trump's ire here, yeah, take Chinese money. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to our some warning items here. Not exactly warning, but this is some good news. Consumer confidence came out yesterday from the conference board. They reported that consumer confidence rebounded by 12 points in May. It's up to 98, an index score of 98 that beats the median forecast of 87. So it beats expectations there. Great news. The survey also found that 12-month inflation expectations rose to 6.5%. That's up by another 0.5%. However, and there's been a lot of talk about inflation expectations because the University of Michigan has their own survey, and I think they're like up at 8%. The 12-month future inflation expectations, they say, is up to 8%. But in a recent note to clients, Goldman Sachs came out and said they're actually less concerned about inflation. They see PCE, which is the Fed personal consumption expenditures, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. They see core PCE rising only to 3.6% this year due to tariffs. They say it's going to be a one-time hit, and then inflation they see receding next year, which is interesting because Jamie Dimon was at this economic conference in China last week, and he said everything's inflationary. So something we'll keep an eye on there. All right, moving on to the next item here. I don't listen to the All In podcast, but I'm going to start listening to it far more often because they talk about some very interesting things. Ron Johnson was on, Senator Ron Johnson, Republican from Wisconsin, was on the All In podcast several days ago. And he outlined the risk of the, number one, that the U.S. is running out of options to solve the debt problem, which should not be news to anyone. But he had some very interesting things to say about a potential debt spiral. And so one of the things he was talking about is the Congressional Budget Office projects a $22 trillion increase in debt over the next 10 years. And that is optimistic. With higher borrowing costs, basically he's talking about the likelihood that the Treasury yields rise, which will increase borrowing costs for the federal government. He said that could add an additional $5 trillion on in interest alone, $5 trillion costs in paying off that interest, which is not calculated in this CBO projection. So with higher borrowing costs, bond vigilantes may reprice bonds, could be looking at another downgrade to U.S. creditworthiness. And he said that could lead to a confidence crisis. And this is part of this death spiral of the U.S. fiscal situation. He said this could potentially happen here. Everyone seems to say that growing the economy faster than growing the debt is the only way you're going to solve the debt problem. This is something that the first Trump administration said we've got to grow our way out. And that actually worked up until COVID. And Trump 2.0 here, working on growing our way out of the debt. But they talked about this plan running up against 2 challenges. First, Ron Johnson said too much money is being taken out of the private economy. So economic expansion is more difficult. And second, there are real concerns that the United States is going to face an energy crisis with not enough electricity to power industrial and economic growth. And we've run into that. We've already seen that. We've seen these AI data centers that they want to build. Some of them are delayed up to like 2 years because there's just not enough electricity production. And thing we've been beating this drum for a while here on this show, and that is all these plans to reindustrialize the United States and bring back manufacturing. All that stuff is fantastic. However, we do not have the juice to do it, and we're probably not going to have the juice to do exactly what we want. So I think actually Elon Musk came out just a couple of days ago and said, we're going to run into this problem. It's going to limit economic growth. So grow our way out may not be, I'm not sure how realistic that's going to be, just to be honest with everyone. Also, Johnson said that he opposes this House version of the big, beautiful bill, this government spending bill, because it does not do enough to address the deficit. And there's actually a couple of holdouts in the Senate, and maybe more Republican holdouts in the Senate. And they say this does not cut government funding enough. And so Ron Johnson has been a pro-Trump guy, but he was somewhat critical of President Trump because he said this administration's budget continues to fund the government at quote-unquote Biden levels and is not doing enough to defund the deep state. Lastly, this is not going to shock anyone, but it is shocking in and of itself. Ron Johnson said that the immediate problem is that most of the people in Congress, he says, quote, don't even recognize the full reality. They don't even know the numbers. He continues, he says, quote, we collectively as a society are whistling by the graveyard. Nobody wants to say this is unsustainable because to fix it is painful. And he's saying representatives and senators in Congress just do not want to endure the pain of making these meaningful cuts. This is something we're not going to cut our way out of the debt. So Johnson was elected to the Senate out of the Tea Party movement. He continues to express his deficit hawk bona fides here. Just a couple of closing points here. Number one, he concludes that the United States is not at risk of bankruptcy. He says we're not actually going to outright default because the debt to asset ratio remains pretty low. Even if debt to GDP is increasing, he's talking about all these national assets, natural resources that we have that could be sold off. I mean, there's talk about selling off federal lands. And, you know, this is something that I'm following only tangentially, but mainly on X. But there are a lot of people who live out in the West that say, do not sell off these federal lands because, you know, it's just like taxing the very wealthy. Okay, you can take 100% of every dollar that the top 1% earns, and I forget the statistic, but we're talking like funding the government for weeks. And so it's really a drop in the bucket. So that's probably not a great solution. But he does add, Ron Johnson did add, quote, we've already passed the hinge point, and he's talking here about a majority of voters realizing that they can vote themselves benefits. And he describes that as the death knell of a democracy or a republic. You are here. Moving on to the next item here. All right, Robert, there's been a lot of talk about Democrats pivoting to this Southern strategy. Apparently, maybe there's a lack of Southern strategy heading into the midterms and 28 elections. What's going on?
Yeah, this is a warning from some of these Southern Democrats, especially Texas Democratic Party head Kendall Scudder, that the state level parties in the Southern states, especially Texas, Florida, and Georgia, don't have the election infrastructure to basically gain ground in these states. And they're warning that long-term population shifts over the last few years will give these Southern red states some additional House seats and electoral college votes after the 2030 census. And they're correct. If we move to the next slide, we can see here from the Census Bureau that a lot of these Southern states they're talking about, especially Texas and Florida, have seen significant population growth in the years after the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And some key Democratic-controlled states like California and New York have seen major population declines in those years, only really stabilizing last year. And this has led to increased House seats for red states and a decrease in House seats for California. And I think they're even projecting a significant drop in the Electoral College votes apportioned to California after this 2030 census. And that 2030 census is key because Republicans have continued to push to include a citizenship status question in the census since the original attempt by the Trump administration in 2019. And I expect that they could revive these efforts ahead of the 2030 census.
Robert, there has been talk, like Joshua Steinman, he's a former Trump senior national security staffer. This is what he said. I don't know if it's true. But he said there's nothing in the Constitution that mandates which year you conduct a census, just that it has to be done once a decade. And he has been encouraging the Trump administration to conduct the census sooner rather than later. Because I guess the risk is if a Democrat wins in 2028, takes office in 2029, potentially flooding the country with illegals and then conducting the census to help out some of these blue states that are losing population. Joshua Steinman says, do it now. Go ahead and get the census done. Even it's early, sure, but get the census done and in effect that reapportionment ahead of 2030. I don't know if that's constitutional or not. I'm sure it's going to be challenged in the courts. I guess it really comes down to what the Supreme Court says. But do you think that argument has any merit?
Well, I think it does have some merit because if I remember right, the specific language is that the census has to be conducted within that decade. It doesn't say at the end of or beginning of a decade. I think it's obviously going to be challenged, just like the Trump administration was challenged when it tried to do this in 2019. And I think with the renewed push with Congress and the White House, it might withstand a legal challenge a bit better than it did previously. But yeah, it is definitely going to be challenged. And I think Simon is correct. If the Trump administration does actually want to do this, it's probably better to start pushing this now to get through that court fight before the 2028 election. And I have seen that as that argument about within a decade as growing among the Republicans that are pushing for this. And there's been other people pointing out that this is a key. This 2030 census is key too. And I think it's one of the bigger voices within the Democratic Party was actually Ezra Klein, he's not a Democratic elected official or party official, but he is a major Democrat commentator, and he's the one that's been pushing that abundance liberalism for the last couple of months. And I think he pointed out earlier this year that the 2030 census is going to basically block the national level Democrats from a national comeback if they don't get ahead of this, if they don't get ahead of Republicans on this.
Mm-hmm. Ezra Klein is definitely a party apparatchik. And one of us needs to read that abundance book. Robert, if you don't want to, I'll read it. But I've seen a lot of people talking about it, and maybe it's worth reading just for situational awareness. We'll figure that out. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to the next item. And Jared, just reading through this unclassified DIA report, Defense Intelligence Agency, there's not a whole lot new in it that we haven't already been talking about for the past couple of years. But they did release a declassified version of the Worldwide Threat Assessment. What's the latest here?
Yes. The biggest takeaway here from how I'm looking at it is that the DIA says there are 3 things that will convince China not to forcefully take Taiwan. If they believe unification can still be negotiated, if the costs outweigh the benefits, they will not do it, and if the red lines are not crossed. Longtime early warning subscribers will note that, hey, 2 of those are already gone due to the sovereignty polls for Taiwan. Unification probably isn't going to be negotiated, and it seems like once a quarter we report on Taiwan butting right up against that red line, going, hey, we are independent, we just haven't declared it. So that really only leaves the U.S., Taiwan, and their allies with increasing the costs of taking Taiwan. And to that end, I expect us to see a lot more aggression in the Western Pacific there, a lot more forward deployed weaponry, maybe even in Taiwan. I know there have been training units over in Taiwan from the U.S. We've seen a couple of those come out. And then extreme economic measures, which you've covered pretty extensively from Secretary Bessent, where, hey, don't let China export its way out of its recession, depression, whatever it is. I expect a lot more of what we've been seeing in the coming years in order to deter China from this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that update. And just briefly, Jared, anything else you want to add on this assessment that not just from China?
There was one note that they believe Russia is grudgingly giving China access, and I will be keeping an eye on that because kind of had the same thought on, I don't think Russia really wants to be there, be the junior partner there, but nevertheless they are. There just wasn't enough to make, even a roll-up piece on that.
All right. Fair enough. Thanks for that, Jared. And moving on over to the Middle East, there's a huge battle for influence. This has been going on for many years now. I don't want to say it started with Trump. Actually, it probably started with Obama on his pivot to Iran. And then Trump gets elected in 2016. He pivots back to the Saudis. And then Biden becomes president and he pivots back to Iran. And Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, was very angry. He started talking about, maybe we'll turn around and start selling our oil priced in Chinese renminbi. Not a great thing to say if you're concerned about the petrodollar. And now Trump's back in office, we're pivoting back to the Saudis. And the Chinese are battling for engagement here as well. What's the latest?
So the Chinese are offering visa-free travel to all of the Gulf Cooperation Council's states. They already had it with it was Qatar and the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and that's reciprocal. So Chinese get to go visa-free to them, and they get to go visa-free to China. China's trying to get the same kind of access to the rest of the GCC. And I think what's really happening here is this is a larger move, because we covered that China doing a similar action over in Latin America with 5 states, a lot of which cover the lithium triangle. I think they're trying to really increase their influence over both old school energy via natural gas and oil, and new school energy, all of your green energy, lithium, your NiCad batteries, all of that comes out of South America. And what that will do, if they can achieve it, which I don't think they can, in the long term, that would give China greater indirect leverage over all non-energy independent states, which I believe currently includes the United States. The United States would have to return to energy independence in order to break that leverage.
All right. Thanks for that update, Jared. And we're at the end of our warning items here, so we'll go ahead and get to today's questions. I just want to point out something. Everyone, hey, thanks for pointing out. Our entire mission here at Early Warning is to be early, to cover things early, cover things before they hit the news cycle. We routinely talk about things days, weeks, sometimes months, even years in advance. And that's all we do every day. We want to give you a strategic advantage, not just over the news cycle, but on these massive changes that are coming. The ball is already rolling. That we go back to that talk that I had with Michael Every about the end of the dollar system. And I'm going to try to get another interview with Every and talk about what the new dollar system looks like. It's going to be very different. And that's going to impact your wallet. It's going to impact your household. These are very real, significant changes happening. And we try to stay ahead of the curve where it matters. So everyone, thanks for the support. If you would like to get our daily report and then also get access to our news and intelligence platform here at Early Warning, you can do that. Head over to www.earlywarningnetwork.com and sign up for a free 7-day trial. With that, Jared, I think we have some questions. Right. Isn't it illegal for governors and states to engage in international diplomacy, especially regarding trade? Well, Robert, that is an interesting question, because we've seen a lot of governors go abroad. My governor here, Greg Abbott, was in India a few months ago working on these state-level trade deals. And my understanding is that these are not trade treaties. These are just trade deals from one state. So this is not illegal, I guess.
Exactly. This is not like an actual trade treaty. This is states. What they do is they go over to other countries to engage with similar level officials, and they just promote foreign direct investment into their own states, or investment opportunities for these countries to go seek trade deals with the United States, with the federal government, and put that money toward investments within the states.
Right. Fair enough. Great answer. Thanks, Robert. Next question. What metrics do they use for consumer confidence? That's a great question. You can go to Conference Board, just Google the Conference Board. They publish a range of different surveys. One of them is consumer confidence. I actually don't know how they derive that, but we can figure it out. Next question. At the current rate of debt, at what point does the debt spiral significantly impact Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and DOD? What effect will that take? Default or hyperinflation or something else? Well, Peter, that's a good question. And I guess we'll kind of take this one by one. It is already impacting Social Security, Medicare, in Medicaid. The big push that we're seeing now from the Trump administration, I've seen just limitless criticism and accusations from Democrats that the Trump administration is trying to cut your Medicare and cut your Social Security and kick you off all these benefits. And what they're trying to do is remove I forget the statistic. I talked about it a couple of weeks ago. Remove the able-bodied people off of Medicare. And they're not trying to kill Medicare. They say they're actually trying to save Medicare by kicking off people who do not need it so that they can save those funds for people who do need it. And so it is already impacting those things. The CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has been saying for some time that early 2030s, Social Security and Medicare will be running out of money if nothing is done. I think that's pretty optimistic. I actually think like probably before 2030, late like 2028, 29, if nothing is done. So it sounds like at some point this big, beautiful bill is going to pass the Senate, and then they're going to make some of these reforms to Social Security and Medicare. But I still think they're underwater. And so just talk, the obvious stuff. You have to raise taxes or raise inputs into Social Security or your FICA taxes, cut benefits, or expand the retirement age. I think all those things are on the table. In terms of what this will lead to, default or hyperinflation or something else, I agree with Ron Johnson. I don't think the United States is going to outright default, but I think there is basically a technical default, because not only do we have $37 trillion in public debt, but we actually, we have over 200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And so the argument has been, you cannot cut that out of federal spending. You can't cut that much out of federal spending. You cannot tax that amount out of the economy. So you're going to have to do some combination of printing it away, which is another reason why we should expect much higher long-term inflation. But I think what's probably going to happen is there will be some sort of debt restructuring. We've seen this in many countries. When we look at that debt to GDP ratio, depending on how you calculate the public debt or the national debt, the United States is conservatively probably at 100% debt to GDP, very conservatively. I think we're probably closer to 120, maybe 125% debt to GDP. Traditionally, anything over 90% leads to some sort of fiscal crisis. Anything over 120 leads to a major fiscal crisis. 130 to 150, when a country has 130% debt to GDP ratio, 130 to 150, they say is the point of no return. And I'll say that with an asterisk because Japan has 265% debt to GDP ratio. And eventually this house of cards will have to fall. We will have a global sovereign debt crisis. It is coming. I don't think there's any way around it. These countries are way too indebted. They're never going to be able to pay them off, especially when you start to look at demographics. And the demographic decline is going to start eating into these countries' ability to pay off the debt. It is going to happen. I don't know when that trigger will be, but it is going to happen. And so when we're looking at here, hyperinflation is one possibility. I'll get to that in just a second. But I think probably what we're looking at here is a debt restructuring where the United States comes out and says, maybe they discharge some debt. If we get into a conflict with China, it is extremely realistic that Congress just says, well, China holds, X, $500 billion, or I forget how much money it is, $600 trillion in treasuries, and we're not going to pay that debt back. So I think there will be some combination of discharging the debt, but a lot of people are going to get haircuts. And what happens is the treasury is going to come to these bondholders and say, we can't pay you back 100%, but we'll pay you back 70 or 80%. And at the point that happens, I think a lot of investors will be happy to get back 70 to 80% of these bonds upon maturity, because it's going to beat whatever the stock market's doing, which is going to be far worse than 70 or 80% of whatever it was at the peak. And it will not be zero. And some investments will be going to zero. We're talking about a financial crisis that would put 2008 to shame. I do think it's coming. I don't know when. But a lot of people far smarter than me have been saying that for a long time. And I do think that's coming. So I think that's what's going to happen. There's going to be some sort of debt restructuring. And it's going to be painful for everyone. Now, in terms of hyperinflation, back in 2021 or 2022, I did a deep dive. I read a bunch of books on hyperinflation, the history of hyperinflation all around the world. And there were like 5 things that a central bank cannot do in order to avoid, if it wants to avoid hyperinflation. And at the time, the Fed was doing like 3 out of the 5. They're doing 3 out of the 5 things they should not be doing. And so my big conclusion on hyperinflation is everyone wants to say money printing causes hyperinflation, which is technically true. But it's not money printing alone. Hyperinflation is actually a complete loss of faith in a currency where people spend it as soon as they receive it. They don't save it. They save in something else. They put if it's going to be food or livestock or precious metals or some real hard assets. And at the point you get hyperinflation, what happens is war is the number one trigger for hyperinflation. Okay. Money printing lots of money cocks a gun, but pulling the triggers is historically war has been the number one trigger of hyperinflation. And what happens is wars are so destructive to a country's economy. And when you have economic destruction, whether you're being invaded or you're being bombed, or maybe there will be some form of cyber attacks in the next war, maybe we won't be getting bombarded with munitions, but we'll be bombarded through cyber attacks. What happens is you erode the tax base because people are out of work, they don't pay taxes. And so a government has to figure out how to make up that shortfall. And in many cases, they do not cut budgets, they print money. And so printing money to fund that loss of tax revenue has a couple of problems. Number one, it's very inflationary because a central bank has to print more money. As inflation goes up, the central bank has to print more and more money successively month over month. If you're 5, 10, 20% inflation month over month, the currency doesn't buy as much. And so these central banks are forced to print more because costs are rising. And so what happens is you get into these hyperinflationary spirals where people do lose faith in a currency and they spend it as soon as they get it. They do not save it. And that increases the velocity of money, which is extremely inflationary. And then, all of a sudden people are bringing wheelbarrows of German marks to ride a bus in Weimar, Germany. So I look at hyperinflation and I will just say, I don't think hyperinflation will happen unless we get into an extremely damaging, a war that fundamentally reduces our economic output. If we do get into a war with China or Russia or whoever else, whenever else, if we do get into a war and it damages our economy to the point where we're facing like Great Depression level scenarios, I think hyperinflation is far more likely. Otherwise, I'm not that concerned about hyperinflation, just honestly, until the point where we do have a trigger where people lose faith in the dollar. And right now, that's just hard for me to fathom, given how widespread the dollar is still used around the world. I do think there's some guy on Twitter, some other some geopolitical Twitter account was talking about, China and Indonesia are working on bilateral trade, so they don't trade in the dollar, and they're talking about de-dollarization. And I said, good golly, the dollar may not exist in another 700 years at this rate. So I think it will happen eventually. It is not going to happen anytime soon. So the long way of answering your question, I'm not that concerned about hyperinflation. I'm far more concerned about debt restructuring, which there's no way around it. It's going to be painful for everybody. So I hope that answers your question. I take it that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid reform is no longer the third rail of politics, which really entered a new world. Well, I think they are trying to reform by kicking all these able-bodied people off. It was like 40% or something like 40% of these Medicaid expansion beneficiaries are able-bodied. They are able-bodied. They're between the ages of like 19 and 34 or something like that. So prime workforce age, and they're just not working because they don't have to. So I think that's the problem that Congress is trying to solve right now. Regarding Taiwan, is there a breakdown of the demographics of those who support unification and those who don't? I'm wondering if China waits a generation and will achieve their goals. Jared, we've heard competing narratives on this for a while. There's a former Taiwanese general who said young people don't want to fight for Taiwan. And then we've heard other surveys that say young people in Taiwan will actually fight the Chinese for Taiwan. How would you answer this question?
So Taiwan releases those polls periodically. I don't remember if it's semi-annually or annually, but I try to read them when they come out. There's not normally a demographic breakdown, but based on the fact that the farther away from being unified with China they get, the less amenable they are to reunifying with China. It seems to me that the younger generations just don't want to do that, and they increasingly view themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese. Which I saw somebody mention KMT in the chat, the Kuomintang. That's the old Chinese National Party that moved to Taiwan, and that's actually probably worth mentioning. Is that even for those that want unification with China, they don't want it under the CCP. They want it under the Chinese National Party. So there's a unification movement of sorts, but it's not as big as what a lot of people like to think.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. So we have had that discussion many times before. KMT is technically the pro-unification party, and KMT officials have traveled to China many times to have those types of discussions, I think. But KMT does not want unification in the same way that the CCP does.
Yeah.
What you're saying. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Fantastic. Next question. What's China's overall presence in Saudi Arabia? That's a great question. I actually don't know.
I was actually just listening to a couple of Saudi experts yesterday, and they didn't really mention China a whole lot. There was a little bit of look from MBS to China during the Biden administration, which we covered, but Saudi Arabia is largely focused on, okay, what's Israel doing? What's Iran doing? What are the Houthis doing? How do we stay safe between the three of these? They're not super worried about China because it's China. If they want to give them money, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there's some Chinese interest in Saudi oil projects. I know China gets oil from Iran, but isn't part of that CPEC pipeline, I guess, now running through Afghanistan, or at least on paper, planning to be run through Afghanistan? Doesn't that go to Saudi Arabia as well?
That would have to go all the way through Iran, Iraq, and then potentially Kuwait to Saudi Arabia. And if you go overseas, I think Afghanistan would still have to run through Iran and then through Yemen, UAE, and Oman just to get to Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's going to run right through there. But nevertheless, China will try to buy Saudi oil. It's just at the end of the day, I
thought they were trying to build overland pipelines to reduce their dependency on shipping, like maritime logistics, vis-a-vis the Malacca Strait. All right, well, let's move on here to the next question.
This one.
At some point in the near future, could y'all explain why Yemen is so important to Russia, China, and the United States?
Yeah, I could explain that right now.
Yeah,
look at the Red Sea crisis. They control the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. If you shut that down, you shut down, I think it was 10% of travel at the time. So you get to control it. That's choke points allow tiny nations to punch way outside their weight. That's why Yemen matters. That's the same reason Oman and largely why Iran matters. That's why Egypt matters. None of them are major players on the stage except for their choke points.
Yeah, I was going to add, if you're Russia or China, you want the United States resources and military assets also distracted. You want ISR, you want a lot of assets having to pay attention to somewhere else in the world, try to put out these other brush fires so that one country or the other doesn't get the full brunt of U.S. capability.
Yep.
That'll be my piece. All right, I think this is the last question here. So they announced Trump wants to buy over $1 billion in Bitcoin. Do you see that as a way of the administration is attempting to stave off our economic issues? All right, I'm going to give you the long form answer here. There's a book that I think everyone needs to read. It's called The Sovereign Individual, and it is not about sovereign citizens. Every time I've mentioned that book, it's not about sovereign citizens movement. It's a book that was published back in the 1990s, and Davidson and Rees-Mogg are the authors. It is a book about 500-year shifts in the West. These authors say every 500 years there is a metapolitical shift that occurs in the West, and you go back to the age of anarchy and plunder prior to 1000 AD, and then in 1000 AD you get the age of feudalism, and then in 1500 AD you get the industrial age, and the argument goes technological advances lead to these metapolitical shifts, and by metapolitical they mean changes in how places are governed. And so you have, in the age of feudalism, you have these knights running around, and a lot of people think that knights were all chivalrous and they were, good people, Sir Galahad and whoever else. But actually, they're kind of rampaging and pillaging their way through these peasants. And so the peasants got together and they found their local knight and they said, "Hey, would you protect us?" And the knight said, "Well, yeah, sure, of course. If you work the land and you give me your whatever share of your produce, yeah, sure, I'll protect you." Okay, now the age of feudalism is born, and this was a time when a suit of armor, a suit of armor was something like, I don't know, $100,000 or $200,000. Okay, so this was like very wealthy people could afford this, and that was the metapolitical system under which they lived for roughly 500 years. And then in 1500, you have the invention of gunpowder and rifles. And now all of a sudden that armor was useless against a rifle. And you get much larger military capability pushed down to much lower level. And so now you have a bunch of people with guns running around. And now we have these, and now you have the industrial age from 1500 to 2000. Nation states. So we went from feudalism to nation states, where you were a citizen of a country. And that's a system that we have lived in since. And then in 2000, you get this transition to the information age or the digital age. And the authors say that the concept of a nation state is going away. Just like we don't answer to our local lords. We don't have a vassal and serf system anymore. We don't have exactly a feudal system anymore. During this next political shift, we're eventually, our kids, grandkids, so on, are going to look back and say, these people paid taxes to a country so they could be citizens? That's nuts. And so they say the nation state is going away. And what we're going to have instead, it will be much more akin to enclaves or city states, where you have these enclaves or city states, and they compete for productive citizens. This is no longer going to be the case where the top 4 quintiles of society are going to sacrifice to save the bottom quintile. It's just not going to happen anymore. And that's the system we live in today, especially in the United States. And instead, these enclaves are going to compete for productive citizens. You're going to go there. You're going to leave there. It's going to be, some people will probably call it an AI hellscape, but it will be secure. It'll have sufficient national defense or national security and very low taxes, and you're going to live it. It's going to be crypto based. In this book, they talk about crypto money, what we call cryptocurrency or crypto assets today. Or excuse me, they called it cyber money. Today, we would call it cryptocurrency or crypto assets. On the campaign trail, the Trump campaign mentioned that they want to build 10, I think they called them Liberty cities or something like that. They said, we want to go into federal lands and we want to build 10 cities. Like, these are techno-futurist cities. These are cities of the future, and we want to build it and we want to pioneer it. And as soon as they said that, I said, somebody in the Trump administration has not only read, but digested The Sovereign Individual. It's a fantastic book. It is required reading if you want to understand the future. I do believe 100% this is where we are headed. Yes, Davidson and Rees-Mogg, The Sovereign Individual. And so the next question I ask myself is, okay, Trump is going all in on crypto. Why is this? And I honestly believe that I think the people, senior officials in the administration, I think they understand this shift, this metapolitical shift. The nation eventually, I'm not talking about 5 or 10 years from now, but over the course of the next 50 or 100 years, many nation states are going away. And instead, what you're going to have are these, there may be techno-feudal enclaves, but you're going to have these basically city-states emerge, or these enclaves, or these much smaller areas. And they're going to be competing for the most productive people. And you're going to want to move your family there because it's going to be safe and it's going to be low tax. And you're going to be free to live your life with minimal government interference. And so I do think that's probably the future. And so the question is, why is Trump buying all this Bitcoin? I think because they also understand fiat money will not last forever. That's one of the big things that Michael Every made. That's one of the main points that he made in my interview. If you haven't seen that interview, you should definitely watch it. He said the dollar system is ending because it was always meant to end. It was always going to end. You cannot have a country export the dollars. You can't have a monetary system where a country produces nothing but more dollars. And this system was deliberately set up, and the United States had to export its manufacturing because we have to buy more than we sell. When we buy things in dollars, we export dollars to foreign countries. They turn around and they buy other things in dollars. That is why we have this global dollar system. It cannot work any other way. The United States cannot be a net manufacturer and a net seller of things. If we manufacture things, we have to sell them abroad. When we sell more than we buy, we're sucking dollars out of this global system, which is something you cannot do. You have to put more dollars into the global system because more countries need more dollars to buy more things. That's how you have the dollar system. It cannot work any other way. Eventually, the United States will run out of steam because we cannot specialize in making money from money when our competitors like China have specialized in production. And Michael Every says one of the things is the United States, because we have exported production abroad, we can no longer make the things we need. We can't make missiles and fighters and aircraft carriers and all the things that we need in the quantities that we need them to fight off a peer competitor like China. And so this is part of this long-term reversal. I think the Trump administration, I think Scott Bessent understands that the dollar system will have to change because we cannot continue to export our production abroad. We can't keep moving jobs abroad. We got to bring those jobs back, which means we're going to be making more things, which means we're going to be selling more things. So this dollar system is ending, but it has to end. Otherwise, the United States is just going to collapse. This is what mercantilism or neo-mercantilism is all about. It's using your economy to build your national power. We cannot build our national power if we do not have manufacturing. If we can't make our own steel, if we can't pump our own oil out of the ground, if we can't make our own stuff here, we do not have the national power we need to compete against our competitors. And so the long form answer is I think the Trump administration understands this. I think they understand completely. All fiat currencies go to zero. They will go to zero. We are going to live in an era. In your lifetime, you will probably see more fiat currencies go to zero, especially once we have this big sovereign debt crisis. So there will be a new dollar system, and it will probably be far more akin to crypto than to fiat. It has to be. So why does the Trump administration want to buy Bitcoin? Because I think they understand that there has to be something that backs this next crypto dollar, or whatever you want to call it. The dollar, it's not the e-dollar, which is what we have now. It's the crypto dollar. And so, I think they understand that cryptocurrencies are the currency of the future, the money of the future. And I think that's why there's been such a big push to get into crypto and to be the national leader in crypto. One other point here that I will make, and this is something that Michael Every has talked about before. I talk about this Deutsche Bank report. These Deutsche Bank asset managers went over to China, and they said in every single meeting with their Chinese clients, every single Chinese client was asking how to buy more gold. How do I buy physical gold? How do I buy more? And Michael Every's argument was, or the hypothetical, which I don't think is a hypothetical anymore, is there will probably be some sort of gold-backed currency that China uses for external trade. This is how they're going to compete with the dollar. And when China pivots to a gold-backed currency, just for external trade, the United States is going to pivot to crypto. There will be a crypto dollar. And we're probably talking about stable coins in the interim, dollar-backed stable coins. And this is something that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has even said. He said you create, I think, up to like $2 trillion in new demand by these stable coins, exporting the use of these dollar-based stable coins abroad as a digital payment rail for the dollar-based system. So that's going to be part of the new dollar-based system. At any rate, that's the long-form question. Thanks for being patient and bearing with me through that. Bottom line, why is the Trump administration so into crypto? I think because they understand that this is the future. Whatever replaces, something has to replace fiat. And it's going to be some version of crypto assets or cryptocurrencies. Last question here. Do you think there will be kinetic warfare over collapsing fiat currencies? Yeah, sure. Why not? I don't see why there wouldn't be, because a lot of people are going. There's something like the world owes itself $50 trillion. There's $50 trillion in debt that countries owe each other or banks have loaned out to whoever. And I think there's going to be a huge problem when those people realize they're not going to be paid back. And so you're going to have like the French and the Belgians invading the Ruhr Valley of Germany. And I think there probably will be something like that where you do have a country that say, well, we loaned out money to our neighbor, or we loaned out money to this country and they've defaulted. They're not going to pay us back. And we're not going to take the losses. So we're going to go take some arable land, or we're going to go take some industrial areas. I don't see why that wouldn't happen. I couldn't tell you exactly where it's going to happen, but just in general, yeah, I think there probably will be warfare, interstate conflicts over the collapse of fiat at any rate. Everyone, that's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Thanks so much for being here. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.